within the Secretariat and the entire organization to always mark the month of March as a special month where we commemorate women's achievement across our membership, and also where we try to put together as many initiatives as possible that focus on women empowerment. And the second reason why we chose the panel that we have today is because we are launching a very important publication. It's a recently conducted study by ATAF called "Are Tax Policies Developed to Reduce Gender Inequality in ATAF Member Countries?" A desk review. So as you know, those who are familiar with the work that we do, especially in the context of the ATAF Women in Tax Network, ATAF recognizes the importance of tax and gender parity in tax, and always seeks to determine to what extent such parity exists among our membership. And the study that we're going to be discussing today specifically looks at the possible influences that might have been inherited from patrilineal arrangements within our tax administration, especially in the colonial and the post-colonial era. So to kickstart this, I'm going to first quickly introduce my panel. Like I said, an all-women panel, all experts in their respective rights. Let me start with Mrs. Veronique Hermini, who is the Commissioner General of Seychelles Revenue Commission, and who is also a board member of the ATAF Women in Tax Network. Then we have Mrs. Varsha Singh, who is also a board member of the ATAF Women in Tax Network and who heads the Strategy Planning and International Cooperation Division of the African Tax Administration Forum. And then we have Mrs. Lazelle Terreblanche, who is the chairperson of the Africa Industry Tax Association and also a member of the AWITN, the ATAF Women in Tax Network. And last but not least, we also have Mrs. Nakato Susan, who is one of the lead researchers in that working group that developed the paper. And Susan is also a manager, strategic planning, information management, and reporting at the African Tax Administration Forum. As for me, my name is Romeo Nkulu Ella. I work in the Department of International Cooperation as well, and I'm responsible for membership engagement at the ATAF Secretariat. So let's jump right into it. I want to start with you, Lazelle. First of all, welcome. And in briefly introducing yourself, if you can just give us an idea of your understanding of gender equality.
Thank you, Romeo. The topic we're discussing is very close to my heart. My understanding of gender equality is that it's equality between men and women in relation to economic and social factors under law, opportunity, and voice. It encompasses fairness, the same access to information services, resources, benefits, and the important ability to influence and contribute to policy making. According to the UN's Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality is not only a fundamental right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable country and the world. This is very important for ATAF and also for the Africa Tax in Women Network that you've mentioned before. Just to note, the persistence of gender equality has caused the stagnation of social progress. And what makes it critical for ATAF members is to address the social, cultural, and economic patterns of men and women as they seek to move towards SGC 5. And then I think, Romeo, just if I can just talk to bias and in the context of what we consider to be gender bias and the types of gender bias that we see with tax policy. Janet Stotsky, that's referred to in the paper that we're actually launching today, differentiates between two types of gender-based bias in taxation, i.e. explicit and implicit bias. Explicit bias are those provisions in tax laws and regulations which deliberately treat men differently from women. Fortunately, there are very few examples left of this, but an example is in South Africa, where prior to 1995, husbands were, from a personal income tax perspective, taxed at a lower rate than their wives. Then if I can move on to implicit bias. Implicit bias occurs where provisions, though not deliberately discriminatory on grounds of gender, have different implications for men and women. It manifests itself through the choice of goods and services that are either exempted or taxed. And not only it manifested through that, but VAT levied at the standard rate for sanitary towels is a clear example of this. And then just back to you, Romeo.
Thank you very much, Lizelle. I think this takes us very nicely into the next aspect that we're going to look at. You have spoken about the explicit and the implicit biases and given us an understanding of what we can, how we could potentially define gender biases and gender inequalities within the context of tax administrations. So I want to turn now to Susan. Based on this study, which you had closely worked in with a number of researchers, can you say that the current tax policies and legislations in ATAF member countries effectively affect gender equality?
Thank you very much, Romeo. Yes, to a large extent, the current tax policies and legislation affect gender equality in Africa, more especially the women and the low-income earners. Take an example of the 3 major tax heads in the 35 ATAF member countries. The value-added tax, which is VAT, that contributes 31.1%, the personal income tax, which is PIT, that contributes 19.6%, and the corporate income tax, which is CIT, that contributes 17.7%. The features of these tax heads have a negative effect on the women and the low-income earners. The following 6 features were found to have a negative effect on the women and the low-income earners. The high PIT threshold, which is above the poverty line, the high headline PIT rates, the low CIT headline rates, the high presumptive turnover tax threshold, the revenue dependence on the VAT, and the high standard VAT rates. To further illustrate the above 6 points, research indicates that corporations are male-dominated. Women control only 17% of the companies. On the other hand, most women-owned medium and small enterprises are unincorporated. This implies that most women are under the individual income tax regimes. The PIT headline rates are high, ranging from 60% to 37.5%, compared to the CIT rates that range from 25% to 35%. The recent concluded global standards by the OECD suggests introducing a minimum corporate tax, which is likely to introduce more implicit bias. My second point to illustrate the 6 features that were found to have a negative impact is most countries are taxing the informal sector. 80% of the women in Africa are employed in the informal sector. Research indicates that the presumptive turnover tax threshold are above the poverty line, sometimes way above. The flat tax rates on the turnover are a disadvantage to the women because they affect the low profit and which encroaches on their capital. My two last points to illustrate the 6 features that clearly came out that were affecting the women and the low income earners, where is the extensive VAT collections. Africa, 30% of the revenue is collected from the VAT. This affects consumers and the entrepreneurs, more especially when levied on the basic goods and services, such as the fuel, the health care, and the child care, on which women spend a bigger share of their earnings than men do. Lastly, the average standard VAT rate, which is 16%, affects women not only as the final consumers, but also as entrepreneurs. Most women are in the informal sector and cannot claim back their input VAT, which affects their profits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. These are quite, I want to say shocking, but quite interesting statistics as well. CG Hermini, as a head of tax administration, you've heard what Susan has just presented, that women, low-income earners within our societies are mostly affected by those biases, whether it's from through VAT, PIT, and or even to a large extent through the informal sector. Can you tell us to what extent tax authorities are taking those aspects, those figures into consideration in devising the policies and in implementing the policies within tax administration?
I think, Romeo, that generally tax authorities seems to, the overall picture basically is that we tend to, there's little evidence that we actually develop policies with any concern for the impact on inequality between the sexes. So we generally gender neutral. We are applying basic principles of taxation in designing the policies, but across gender. Gender equality in taxation goes beyond the basic human rights and employment of women in revenue authorities. So if we look a little bit at the statistics, globally in 2020, men occupied 77% of executive positions and women only 23%. In Africa, gender imbalance characterizes tax administrations. It was observed that women accounted for 27.15% of executive positions in revenue authorities in ATAF member countries in 2020. Looking at certain specific examples, Gambian and Nigerian revenue authorities, for example, actually had all male executive management teams in 2019, and as did Niger in 2018. By contrast, the Burkina Faso and Eswatini revenue authorities managed to maintain a gender balance. Whilst in Seychelles, where I come from, a country much smaller in size and population, 2/3 of the employees at the Seychelles Revenue Commission are female. A good example, and it's at 78%, and women represent 74% of our management team. Our recruitment policy is actually gender neutral. The Ugandan Revenue Authority is also one of the few that has employed relatively high numbers of women. SARS, the South African Revenue Service, has a Women Empowerment and Gender Equality Steering Committee and uses sex disaggregated data in human resources policymaking. Overall, there has been a rise in the share of women in senior positions in African tax administrations from a female to male ratio of 1 to 2.51 in 2010 to 1 to 1.78 in 2020. It was also observed from the study that female staff retention tends to be much longer compared to male, and that there is a tendency for higher staff turnover for the male gender. So, if we look at the gender statistics, few countries systematically analyze the impact of tax administration or compliance on gender. Although revenue administrations may be the most important holder of vital statistics for economic performance assessment, Data being collected are mostly related to collection by tax type or economic sector. Consequently, there is little or no research into the impact of taxes on female-owned businesses in developing countries. When available, gender disaggregated data is useful to understand possible biases and gender-specific patterns. It will indeed enable policymakers to assess the impact of tax policies on female-owned businesses or female-run households. For the 16 ATAF countries assessed, Uganda maintains gender disaggregated tax administration statistics. With regards to use of household data to simulate the tax impact on gender, the South Mode micro simulation model supports only 7 African countries so far. We have South Africa, Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, and Uganda. In November 2021, Nigeria made its first use of a micro simulation model. In Seychelles, I have to admit, we do not maintain records in terms of gender, but we recently reviewed our registration forms to capture this information as we are being requested internationally for certain data. So today it is difficult to obtain information from relevant authorities in Seychelles and in other countries as well on how many women are involved in certain sectors of our economy. Information are available for employment, but not necessarily for business activities. If we look at good practices, there's some countries on the African continent which have set examples. For example, Angola allows the self-employed in listed industrial and commercial activities to keep simplified accounts to deduct 30% of their business costs. Ghana taxes the income of certified companies in the low-cost housing business at a rate of only 1%. For VAT, African states should probably look at the example of Singapore by keeping VAT rates low to ease the cost of doing business. We have Zambia also, which introduced an allowance of 2% for locally grown cassava, mango, and pineapple. We have Nigeria, reduced rates for CIT for small companies, so capturing even the women in business. And Seychelles has no VAT on construction of residential houses to help reduce tax burden on households. And its personal income tax regime takes the primary income only, as there is no requirement for declaration of other emoluments. Its presumptive tax regime is simplified at the rate of 1.5% of turnover, with a PAYE system to better assist the small businesses operating in the informal sector. So that's it, Romeo, with what I've been able to gather from the report and sharing with the audience with regards to gender equity.
Thank you very much, Commissioner General. This gives us already an idea of some of the initiatives that have been taken at countries levels. You've mentioned Angola, Ghana, Zambia, Nigeria, which are very encouraging initiatives. And still in that perspective, I'd like to turn now to Varsha and perhaps ask you, in addition to some of those encouraging initiatives that has been mentioned already by the CG, what are, in your opinion, some of the recommendations that ATAF and in its members and other development partners should probably put in place in order to promote the development of tax policies that are conducive to gender equality?
Thank you, Romeo. And I think firstly, before I go into that, I just want to say that, you know, from the research that is being conducted, we find that, and it has been mentioned by both the CG as well as by Susan, that there is a lack of data on tax policies to reduce gender equality. But I think at the same time, what we need to bear in mind is that gender-sensitive tax policy is important for us for widening, firstly, the tax base and also improving tax efficiency. So when looking at that, and in order to move towards broadening the tax base and improving tax efficiency, I think there are 4 areas that we can look at. Firstly, there is the commitment that ATAF, through the Women's in Tax Network, has made on gender equality. So when we look at that, and if we need to look at putting in place a gender balance guide for ATAF member countries, and the CG mentioned where we are currently as portrayed in this research paper. And we also need to look at the statistics that has come out, for example, on the number of women that are at an executive level. So we need to encourage that there are more women at an executive level and senior management levels in tax administrations, but also women that are able to be part of the decision making. So while we talk about management and executive positions, I think we also need to bear in mind that there is a huge tax policy perspective to this, and that we need to encourage revenue administrations as well as ministries of finance to have women playing a role in the development of tax policy. So women in critical technical positions, but also in specialized areas. For example, we should have more women leading on tax policy, but also in terms of transfer pricing units, exchange of information, etc. So I think those are some of the things. The third one is we will need to do more of this, carry out gender impact analysis before tax policies are passed and implemented, to make sure that gender has been taken into account. The next one that I want to talk about is data. And we've spoken about the lack of data and that more countries are moving towards it, but we need to make sure that we collect it and that we maintain 6 disaggregated tax administration statistics in ATAF revenue authorities. Now, ATAF has a publication, which is our flagship publication, which is called the Africa Tax Outlook. And we have recently, as the network, been working with the team of the ATO to look at how we can bring in more, gendered data that is collected by ATAF member countries. So that is something that we know we need to do, and it is something that we are working towards. Then the third one is about good practice. And we've, again, both Susan and the CG and Lizelle have mentioned some of the good practices that are out there. So one of the things as a network we would be looking at is to develop a good practice guide in terms of case studies, things that are happening that we can work with other member countries and help them to facilitate these exchange of best practices, and also to be able to look at what tools we can provide to our members to enable this to happen, and that it becomes part of any, not just in terms of tax policy, but also any reform, any modernization that tax administrations are going through, that there's always a gendered lens when looking at it. And we are a big network. We can look at what is best happening in these countries to be able to do that. The last one is, and as the CG mentioned, there is only 7 countries that are looking at micro simulation models. So this is something that needs to definitely be strengthened, and we need to help our member countries in ensuring that there are comparative decision-making that is taking place. So I think that if you look at these 4 broad areas, they will, and if we look at the recommendations from a tax administration perspective, once we all are owning it, we can make sure that it becomes part of our day-to-day practice when in our implementation in our revenue administrations. Thank you, Romeo.
Thank you very much, Fosa. It looks like a really well-devised a strategy and approach to tackling gender imbalances within tax administration. And perhaps I should just remind our viewers, those who are joining us online, that we keep on making reference to the African Women in Tax Network. In fact, let me not do that and ask maybe one of you, either CG or Lazelle or Varsha, to just briefly introduce the African Women in Tax Network and what you do, because it's a recently launched a network, and already we can see some of the impacts that it's producing in the tax landscape in Africa. So if I can just invite you to say a few words on the work of the AWITN.
Okay, so Romeo, maybe I can start. And I think what is really very good in terms of the panel we have today, it is a good representation of the network. So the ATAF Women in Tax Network was launched last year in 2021 in March. And it is made up of women from Africa, from the continent, working in tax, but not just from tax administrations or from ministries of finance. It includes women from the private sector, as represented by Lazelle, who represents the private sector on the board, and the CG of Seychelles, as well as the CG of Mozambique, represents the revenue administrations. And then we have representations also from civil society. The network also includes women from academia, and we also have this year, there's two parts to the network. So the one is in terms of tax policy, and this research is the first research, and it speaks to the work that we are starting to do on tax policy, and the recommendations that comes out of this research are the next steps that we will be taking. But the other arm of the network is leadership and leadership development for women on the continent. And that we have last year, for example, had our first leadership conference. And this year we have launched a mentorship program, which is made up of mentors and mentees of women that are part of the network. So the more experienced paired up with less experienced women. And again, it encompasses women from all the different areas like civil society, private sector, ministries of finance, etc. So, and then as part of the leadership, we're also looking to develop in the next coming years, a women in leadership program that we will run for the network. So I think we're a young organization, but I think that we're very proud that we are able to launch our first research in the second year of our existence.
Yes, this is definitely a lot to be proud of. This is a lot of impact that we're seeing already on such a short period of your existence. So thank you very much for that, Varsha, for clarifying this. Let me bring in Lazelle again, because we know that the study didn't really go beyond revenue administration. And as a first study, I'm sure that this is something that is going to be looked at later on. But from an industry perspective, what are some of the policy recommendations that ATAF and the partners and the members and other development partners that work with us should put in place still in this objective, in the aim of promoting policies that are conducive to gender equality, just from an industry perspective?
Thank you, Romeo. Yes, I mean that, first of all, I think the current research, even though it was done on a desktop basis, is very useful, and I would love to see it being done in more detail. From a industry perspective, it is my understanding, and I actually found a very interesting document that MasterCard issued regarding females and what they are entrepreneurs. And if I can just read from it, it says women entrepreneurs who account for 37% of global GDP have been more severely affected by the pandemic. Women entrepreneurs are pivotal to expanding our economy. The entrepreneurial spirit sees opportunity in every day to reimagine, refresh, and reinvent, creating the right social, political, and financial understanding and conditions for that spirit should take hold and produce and will produce real world effects. And where I'm coming from on this is that as industry, it is very important for us and for economies to thrive, and policies should start at the bottom and look after women entrepreneurs who we all know are very innovative and industrious. So I would really encourage that we look at those kind of policies where we encourage females and females starting up businesses to thrive.
Thank you so much, Lazelle. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. Maybe we'll take one or two. We didn't quite anticipate for this to be an exchange with the public, but I think some of the questions are quite interesting. Maybe we can take a look at one or two and see if we can answer them. There's a question by Tulada Mika, who's asking if you have any idea how these changes, I'm assuming the improvements, the achievement that we've seen in women and men ratio within tax administration, within ATAF membership, how they got possible. CG, can I invite you from a tax administration perspective to maybe comment on that? How is it possible that in some tax administration we are seeing a reduction in those imbalances according to the question?
Romeo, I can only comment on the perspective of Seychelles. And as I said, Seychelles is a very small country. And recently, or over the years, we've basically become more of a matriarchal society, right? In the sense that women are the ones in charge of the household. This has been gradual because a lot of our young men are actually on drugs. So they're following programs due to heroin addiction. And as a result, we also have some due to petty crimes related to such addiction in jail. So women tend to take over to protect their children. So having a stable employment is important for a lot of women. So one of the reasons why in Seychelles you will find generally across employment and across sectors, women are the ones in full employment. You will tend to see the men more into the casual in terms of the fisheries activity or even casual workers on the farms. So it's a bit difficult for me to talk a bit about what's happening on the continent. And in terms of, that's also to do with culture. So the culture may be a bit different. And but for us in Seychelles, when I mentioned that our recruitment policy is not gender bias, is gender neutral. So we welcome participation or applications from any gender, be it women, and even we don't look at religion, we don't look at your political affiliations. So it's I'm not really sure how to express what we hear, how different we are in terms of the impact of policies on women, basically, compared to the African continent.
So maybe I can come in, Romeo, just from an organizational reform perspective. I think many countries, and the Africa Tax Outlook also shows that there is many member countries of ATAF that have tax policies in place in terms of their recruitment and the way they retain women as well. A good case study, and I think the research also touches on it, is the Uganda case study in terms of how they have worked to bring in women into different roles in the tax administration from at an executive management perspective. But also you will find that when Uganda did a research with the taxpayers, they also found that a lot of taxpayers prefer dealing with women. So I think they are very different. There is a move amongst most of the members to bring in those policies and to have those organizational policies that are gendered in nature. The second thing is that, we in the recommendations that I mentioned about the best practices and also the encouraging our members to look at, sex aggregated data. One of the things that we as the network will be doing in the coming years, once we have this in place, is to develop a barometer that we can keep to monitor how gendered the policies are. And when we talk about gendered policies, it's not just from a tax policy perspective in terms of, the different tax types, but it is also in terms of the organization. And I think that's important to note. And I'm not sure, if there's anything else that the other colleagues would like to bring in as well.
Romeo, I wanted to come in terms of the question asked by Waiswa from Uganda.
Yes, please.
When he was asked that, what do you mean by a high PIT rate? So here, when you compare, given the fact that most of the women, almost the research showed that most of them they fall under the informal sector, and they are the ones paying the PIT. So examples of the countries that have a high PIT, Uganda's headline PIT is at what, 40%? The one for Zambia, it is at 37.5. The one for Cote d'Ivoire is at 60%. When you compare it with the corporate income tax, which ranges between 25% and 35%, and yet the corporations are mainly male dominated, it really introduces the implicit bias. Yes, thank you, Romeo.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm sure that clarifies it and answers the question posed by Ronald. There is another question on micro simulation. I think, Varsha, you were mentioning that in your presentation earlier. So the question is, what is micro simulation model in relation to tax and gender? If you can just clarify that for the audience, please.
Thank you, Romeo. I think that when we're looking at this, and as mentioned in the research, there is 7 countries that are looking at microsimulation models and that have developed them to help in terms of a gendered approach. So this is something that can help in terms of looking at the comparisons, and also that can help you once you have these comparisons in and the benchmarks and the best practices to assist in better decision making. So I think as we find countries that do not have gendered tax policies or gendered approaches in place, they can look at what is out there and microsimulate it with what they currently have in their tax administrations to develop better policies and practices that can be implemented.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Varsha. There are a few more questions that are coming in. Unfortunately, we can't take them all. So we will try and cherry pick some of them and maybe put them together. There's a question about if we are exactly able to tell who spends on female items. I'm not quite sure if you understand that question. If you do, please, you can volunteer a response.
Okay, I don't know if Susan, you want to have a go, but I can just say that one of the things that in this research and one of the recommendations that have come out is, and as I said, this is the first of a series of research that we will be doing. So one of the areas we will be looking at, and particularly when you look at VAT, it will show us some of the consumer patterns, and it'll show us who spends more in terms of what types of products, but that research has not been done. But if you just look at research that has been conducted by various researchers in the field of tax and gender, it has been found that, women tend to be the ones that are spending more on household products. And but definitely this is an area that we intend to do a policy paper in 2023.
Thank you so much, Vasha. In what addition to what you have said, actually the micro simulation models are meant to clearly bring out the other impact on the impact the policies have on gender, because you cannot only analyze it based on the tax revenue, based on only one side. You need to see how, what is the consumption, how is the consumption, the expenditure being what affected, how does one policy affect the expenditure, how does it affect the consumption, how does it affect other economic factors. So that is why the micro simulation models are very, very important, because you cannot only do the impact of the policies on the gender without considering the other external factors that only come through the household surveys. Yes.
Thank you, Susan, for adding to that response. We'll take one last question before we start heading towards the end of the session. There's a question about which region has the lowest and highest gender gap. I'm not sure if this is something that is covered within the studies, Susan.
It is actually covered when you look at Togo, for example. Togo is mainly male dominated. The percentage of the women are actually very, 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 very low. It is around 81%. When we look at Nigeria, all the senior management are mainly male. So the research focuses on all, it has all that information, and it will be very, very interesting for people to read and find out more information in that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. As I told you at the beginning, this discussion was special for two reasons. And the second reason was the launch of this paper that we've just been discussing. And for that, I now would like to invite the Commissioner General of Seychelles Revenue Commission, Mrs. Veronique Hermini, to officially proceed with the launch of this paper. CJ, you have the floor. Apologies, CJ, you are on mute.
I'm sorry, Romeo. I'm not sure whether we close here or do we cover the reforms that's coming from ATAF side, the policy proposals, or do we move and close?
Please, you can go ahead and cover those recommendations first, and then we proceed with the launch.
Okay, so I think substantial reforms have taken place over the years as countries try to increase the tax base and generate more revenue. So some of these reforms involved alignment or reduction in corporate income tax, combined with the liberalization of trade and lower tariffs, which have forced low-income countries to rely heavily on indirect taxation, which unfortunately affects the low-income earners, among which women are overrepresented. So there is thus a need to review the applicable standard rate of VAT to ease the cost of doing business and reduce the cost of households, especially women-run households. Review the PIT rates on high net worth individuals in following the tax principles of fairness, of course. A person should be taxed according to their ability to pay taxes. As they say, equality does not mean equal amount of tax, but equality in tax burden. So by reviewing PIT rates for high net worth individuals, it would more fairly tax income generated from their worth. So there is also proposals for exempt minimum basic income, those falling below the international poverty lines from personal income taxation, to reduce again the tax burden. And here I was quite happy to see that Seychelles is actually leading in terms of the high tax-free threshold that we have. There is also proposals to relook again at the CIT rates. There is a need for further debate on the levels that are being applied. And finally, also rethink tax policies in the informal sector. As we know, the informal sector are made mostly of women, as they try to basically earn a second income or bring a second income to the household. So one should actually take note that working informally deprives women actually of access to certain tax relief entitlements. So as you can see, this the research paper covers quite a broad amount of broad areas, basically. So not only in terms of representations, like we said, but also in terms of how the taxation policies impact on women in general. So I do have the pleasure, and I'm really happy to launch today the first research paper of the Women in Tax Network, Romeo, which will be available on our website effective today.
Thank you very much. We can just give it a round of applause. Thank you. So as the CG has just indicated, you should see it appearing on the screen now, the publication that we have just discussed. ATAF, our ATAF policies developed to reduce gender inequality in ATAF member countries, a desk review. So this paper is now available on ATAF's website. We will share the link subsequently to this event via email and on our social media pages. Please make sure to take a look. It's at ATAF Tax on Twitter and at ATAF Tax on Facebook. And you can find us on LinkedIn as well, under African Tax Administration Forum. On my part, I think what is left to do is just to thank our impressive panel for these discussions. As you can see, this is just the beginning of the discussion on gender matters in Africa within ATAF. The African Women in Tax Network is truly dedicated to furthering this cause across the continent and in the tax landscape. Thank you very much, Lazelle. Thank you, CG Ermini. Thank you, Varsha. Thank you, Susan, for those very, very profound insights and very interesting insights. I'm going to give you each 1 minute to conclude before we officially close the session. Let me start with you, Susan, as the lead in this research.
Thank you so much, Romeo, and thank you all the audience. I really invite the audience to take time and read this paper. It's a very, very interesting paper, and indeed the findings were very, very, very interesting to find that the policies that we are passing in all the different African countries actually do not take the gender equality into consideration. So I look forward to Africa, to ATAF, the different development pattern coming together to ensure that all the policies that we are implementing indeed ensure that the gender equality is completely reduced as we move towards the SDG. Thank you, Romeo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. Pasha, any last words?
Thank you, Romeo. I think that from my perspective, on the screen, you can now see that we are inviting women from the continent to register and to join the ATAF Women in Tax Network. That, you know, as we strive to meet the SDG 5, I think the important thing is that whatever is coming out of the research, that we as tax administrations develop our action plans and make sure that we move to implementation. Lastly, I would like to thank the ATAF Women in Tax Network Research Working Group, led by Susan, for this research. And I'm also happy to report that this month we have just started phase 2 of this research that we would be launching in 2023. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Varsha. Over to you, Lazelle.
Thanks, Romeo. I think what is important from my perspective and the Africa Women in Tax Network is that we bear in mind that our membership is bigger than tax administrations, and that we must ensure that we involve the industry and we also hold them accountable to the extent that gender equity is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I look forward to us further, exploring that angle from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gazelle. And finally, over to you, CG.
Thank you, Romeo. I think we have all agreed that there has been a lot of progress worldwide when it comes to equal opportunities for employment for women, but more needs to be done in regards to the implication of the tax system and policies on women in general. So for me, the report following the further research has been very insightful, and I am sure that quite a lot of us tax administrations are going to consider some of the recommendations and to see how we can also contribute towards SDG 5 to achieve gender equality and empower women and girls in the world. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, and thank you all once again for your contributions. I think we've come to the end of this event, but this is not the end of the discussions. Please feel free to email us at communications@ataftax.org should you have any question. Visit our website and our Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn pages. Thank you all for joining. Goodbye.